This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1082, a conversation with Kelli Fitzpatrick.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1082, a conversation with Kelli Fitzpatrick. Kelli has a new book coming out on March 4th, which I really recommend everyone pick up, which is called Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers Declassified, Notes, Interviews, and Files from the Avengers Archives. Now, I actually did not know when I first read this book that, and this is silly of me, but maybe I wasn't the target demographic, who knows. This is actually the fourth of a series of these types of books, which are kind of a look into a specific character. But what is refreshing, and I talk about this in the interview with Kelli, is that this isn't about the MCU. This is about the classic comic book character. This is about, warts and all, like the entire history of Carol Danvers. It's really wide-ranging. It really is in-depth at times. It's really interesting, and it was an interesting read because it's in the perspective of Ripley, or otherwise known as Star, who's Kelly Thompson character, going through and interviewing Carol Danvers about her history, and then there's a juxtaposition with different media pieces, which are really interesting as well. So if you have not read one of these declassified books, it might be worth picking up the other three as well. I would imagine they would be of similar quality. It's funny because I was recently at a movie with my kids, and afterwards we went to a bookstore, and I saw a bunch of these declassified books, and I was like, oh man, I didn't even realize. I'm so silly. Apparently I haven't been to a proper bookstore in a little while and looked at their graphic novel section and seen these. Anyways, Kelli was a great sport. She had a lot of interesting stories to tell about kind of becoming a writer, her inspirations. We talk a bit about Star Trek. We talk about, comic books, Captain Marvel. So I really enjoyed this. This was a really fun conversation with Kelli. I do recommend you pick up her book. And again, it comes out on March 4th. You can email me at the Comic Shenanigans podcast at comicshenanigans@gmail.com. You can also listen to the show on Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts. You should also listen to us on Spotify if that's more your podcast catcher of choice. We're generally where most podcasts can be found. You'll find us there. Upcoming episodes, I'm really excited. Obviously, with the upcoming release of Daredevil Born Again, I wanted to do something. It won't be right away, but at the end of March for our regular Book of the Month Club episode, we'll be talking about Daredevil. Now, originally, this was going to be a time for us to have Paul Scoras, who's usually the one who hasn't read a lot of stuff. Usually we find stuff he hasn't read and we talk about it. And sometimes my other guest, Nathan Struck, hasn't either. This time we're talking about something a little bit different because we couldn't get Paul to join us. Unfortunately, March is a crazy month for him during his day job. How dare he? So Nate and I will be talking about the Daredevil Batman crossover event of the mid-90s, which was by D.G. Chichester and Scott McDaniel. But the week before that comes out, if everything goes to schedule, I will actually be speaking with D.G. Chichester about working on that particular story. So that'll be a kind of fun twofer that if you've read that, or if you haven't read it but you have the Marvel vs. DC omnibus, I'm going to be talking about it with the creator and then be breaking it down with another fan. So I'm really excited about that. Also this month we have another episode with Scott Dunbier. I'm really excited to have him back on the show. It's been a while, and a lot has happened and changed for him professionally, so I'm really excited to talk with him as well. And on next week's episode, we have a twofer. We've got Chuck Austin, I should say. Chuck Austin and Pat Olive are coming back to talk about their new book, Defiant, which is coming out from Distillery. Anyways, that's some great stuff coming up. Thanks for listening to this preamble. Let's jump right into the conversation with Kelli Fitzpatrick. Enjoy. Kelli, welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. Happy to be here.
Excellent. It's great to have you here to talk about Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers Declassified. And I guess before we jump into it, what was or is your relationship with the character prior to coming on this project?
Yeah, so I've been a longtime fan of Carol Danvers. I just really love her spunk and her resilience and how many different careers she has had. And really just her determination to protect the people that she cares about and to live her values and to just kind of keep getting up no matter what happens. So I was very thrilled when I got to was offered this project, because I got to go back and do a deep dive on the entire comics history of her and revisit some favorite moments and discover a couple of things that, I wasn't familiar with beforehand. So it was a real treat to get to spend this much time with this character.
Now, I should say, as someone who's read the book, like, you're not embellishing the fact that this is a super deep dive. Like, this is nooks and crannies, like a lot of very in-depth kind of look at the character. And it did make me think of, like, what version of Carol Danvers did you first come to know? Like, when I first got to know the character, it would have been during the period when Hero's Return was happening and she had the bout with alcoholism. That was my first impression of the character. I went back afterwards and kind of read, her original appearances, etc. But that was really the version that I first came to know. So I'm curious which version you first came to know.
Yeah, my first experience of Carol in the comics was, I believe it was the 2012 series, when she is taking on the Captain Marvel mantle and kind of rebranding herself. Also, there's like some time travel stuff going on, dealing with health issues, but really like this deep yearning for space and space exploration. And this is something I deeply identify with. I love learning about space and the cosmos and cosmology. And so I was really fascinated by that aspect of her, which is, of course, built upon in the following series, where she gets to go to Alpha Flight Station and explore Torfa. And then, later I went back to her time as Binary and was like, oh, this is amazing. she's the cosmic Avenger. Like, she can just fly through space and literally has the power of a star, so it's really just amazing to me how cosmic her origins are, not just her powers. I think a lot of people are familiar with how powerful she is, but she really does have this deep connection to space and the vastness of what's out there.
You alluded before to the idea that, she's worn so many hats, she's done so many things and had so many jobs. And obviously part of that from a metatextual perspective is that creators didn't really know what to do with her, but skilled creators have been able to take that and actually weave a better kind of narrative. And you've definitely done that yourself in terms of how you kind of stitch together this almost schizophrenic perception of who the character was. And it's interesting looking back at it now because, as you say, since that 2012 series where she became Captain Marvel and has really owned that title, we almost forget how that character had evolved over time and went through a lot of different permutations. Was that a fun part of the research, or was that at times a frustrating part of the research?
I'm going to call it a challenging part of this assignment. It was a cool challenge to tackle, but it was definitely one of the difficult things to sort of get my head around at first, because she has sort of lived all these different lives. And part of the assignment I received from Marvel was that I needed to tell the complete life story of Carol Danvers and make it feel like the life of one person, that it was coherent, that there was a through line. And so I really enjoyed the task of going back and finding that through line. Like, I'm a writer, I'm a storyteller. So like I want to find what are those thematic threads that do tie this together. And I think they are there and they're explored, in this book. I think they have a lot to do with resilience and responsibility, but also identity, like really understanding not just who you are, but what it means to be a coherent person across time. Like, what does that mean? People change and adapt, and yet how do we understand ourselves, across years or decades or a lifetime? And so that was something I really did enjoy. But there were definitely challenges. One of the things with a character that's this long running is that there tend to be echoes and callbacks of similar events and similar things that happened to her. And so I had to acknowledge that and humanize that and think about what would a person, a human / Kree individual who had lived all these things consecutively, how does that affect a person's outlook? And it was an interesting challenge.
I'm curious. One thing I really liked about it is that, obviously a character like this in particular has had these really challenging moments in their own history. I mean, obviously one of the biggest ones that's known throughout the industry is what happened to her in Avengers 200, where, there's, looking back at it now, it's exceptionally problematic. They wrote that comic under insane tight deadlines, and I don't think they really thought it through. And so we have this very problematic storyline with Carol Danvers that everyone kind of knows about the character from the comics, generally has an idea of that. And so doing this through this type of narrative where you have the character talking about it and having someone ask them about it, I thought you definitely kind of wove that part of it in on what would someone's survivor mechanism be from going through something like that, and then also bringing it back to the alcoholism as well. And again, these are topics that I think a lot of people forget sometimes about Carol, that they are part of her tapestry. And I thought the way that you were able to weave them into the narrative and actually have her talk about it was really compelling.
Yeah, thank you. It was definitely one of the topics that we had to handle with care, because, I wanted to do justice to these experiences that have deeply affected her, but that she has also faced with incredible courage and resilience, and sort of grown through. And so I attempted to, handle that with tact and dignity while also not erasing the fact that it happened. And there are, sometimes with superheroes, they kind of get a reputation for just being able to just power through anything. And I think a lot of Carol's story has her really having to confront things and work through things. And sometimes those are things that, ways she has been wronged. There's the incident that you mentioned, but she also has her memories stolen multiple times. And that this is an incredibly traumatic thing that she goes through. She has a brain tumor at one point that she has to, deal with. She loses her powers suddenly. So that she has gone through a lot of trauma. But then she also has some of these struggles that are maybe, less than healthy coping mechanisms for some of the things going on in her life. So she has definitely had her ups and downs. She has had struggles. She's been faced with unimaginable adversity. But I think the way that she has worked through it, I find a lot of inspiration in that. And so that aspect of it was really nice to write and to kind of explore and let her explore that in her own words, so that it wasn't a thing that was appeared in one issue and then of course they had to move on with the story. Like this really, one thing I liked about this book is that it allowed time for her to really sit with it, talk through it, in the interviews.
One thing that you mentioned, which again is something that for fans of the more modern incarnations of the character, and when I say modern, I'm actually being pretty loose here. I'm saying like going back to even 20, 30 years, is that the idea of her being a creative. Because again, that's something they obviously used in the Miss Marvel series by Chris Claremont and others, but not as much since, because we see her as a character being positioned more in the military perspective, especially in the last couple of decades. And it's an interesting juxtaposition with Captain America is another character where the character has a past where he was a comic book artist, but we kind of forget about that most of the time because it's not a part of the character that they usually lean in on. So what was it like kind of crafting or being mindful of her being a creative and balancing that with how she would answer from, more of the superhero / military angle?
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite aspects of her character. And this fact about her that she is a creative. In particular, she's a writer and an editor. That inspired my idea for the framing device in the book. So this book is book 4 in the Declassified series, and each book focuses on one of the very well-known Marvel superheroes. So there's Iron Man, Black Panther, Captain America, and now Captain Marvel. And each book, the authors were allowed to sort of pitch a framing device of why are there a set of files on this character that have recently been declassified, as well as what is the device or the context that's being used to release information about this character or to get the character telling their own story. And for Carol, because her first solo named series, the 1977 Ms. Marvel, had her as a magazine editor at Woman Magazine, that really resonated with me. And so I felt like a return to that aspect of her career would be a cool framing device. So I have one of her nemeses, Ripley Ryan, whose alias is Star, has been hired by Jonah Jameson to do a series of interviews for a sort of anniversary special feature in Woman Magazine. But of course, because they're nemeses, the interviews are a little adversarial at times. And I thought that was important because Carol is so confident and so kind of sure of herself that I needed somebody who could kind of meet her at that level and push her a little bit. But I really did want to center that creative aspect of her. And so she was a magazine editor, but she was also a novelist. She writes a book about her travels as binary. And those pieces of media that I wrote for this book are some of my absolute favorites in the whole thing.
You talk about the framing device. So you have, J. Jonah Jameson is writing something. I'm curious, when you were writing that, how did you nail the voice? Was there a particular, either comics or other media? Did you have a J.K. Simmons in your head? Like what kind of voice did you have in your head when you were writing a character like that, who is very much, a larger than life kind of personality? And it was very much, again, and this is something that I found very enjoyable, but at times surprising just because I'm not used to seeing it, in that it felt like he was right from the comics right now. Like it wasn't, some sort of J. Jonah Jameson in Amber still, head of the Daily Bugle. It was very much, him now, he's not running the Bugle. Like it felt very current in that perspective. And I don't always expect that from other media that aren't the comics. So I thought that was a really nice touch and I really enjoyed it. So I'm curious, who was the J. Jonah Jameson in your head?
So one of the great triumphs of the MCU is that their casting for this character was 100% spot on. So the answer is all of the above because they all sound the same. No, the original thing that I went back to is the 1977 series in which Carol is hired by Jameson and is working at Woman Magazine in the same office with Jameson. And he frequently comes into her office and yells at her about, ratings or why do we have women in Woman Magazine, heaven forbid, things like that. And so there's a very distinctive voice there. But then even in some of the newer comics where Jameson is kind of he's always got an angle, right? So he's got his sort of newer publications and collaborations that he's doing. And so I went back to some of those just to especially get his rhythm and his cadence and his exclamations and things, But yeah, I feel like that character has one of the most fun voices to write. I really enjoyed writing his voice, and Wolverine's voice was also really enjoyable.
I should go back because I realized, I just kind of jumped us right in, but really we should go back and talk about you as a writer. And so, you end up pitching on this project, but where did your kind of own origin story as a writer start?
Yeah, so, I've been dabbling in writing, I think, most of my life. I've always kind of enjoyed it. But my professional writing career started in 2016 when Star Trek ran a contest for the Strange New Worlds short story contest. They revived it for the 50th anniversary of the show, and fans could submit a short story, written in the Star Trek universe, and I submitted and I won. And so that meant that my Star Trek tie-in story got published in an anthology by Simon & Schuster, and I was pulled into the world of professional Star Trek writing, and that was a whirlwind of awesomeness. And so that kind of opened doors to other Star Trek tie-in projects, and then I kind of began branching out in the tie-in writing world, and so this project I was contacted on to see if I would be interested in writing about Captain Marvel, and in fact I was.
What period of Star Trek were you focusing on in that short story that won?
That was a Next Generation story about Beverly Crusher. And if you're familiar with the show, in the 7th season, her son, I will say, goes on a journey, so as not to spoil anything if you haven't seen it. And in the show, there's not really much processing time for Beverly for that. And so the story is her kind of coming to terms with that relationship with her son while she's also solving a medical crisis on a planet.
I mean, it wouldn't be Star Trek if there wasn't a medical crisis or wasn't some crisis, right? Or some phenomenon.
Indeed. But it also, that story kind of just solidified, I've always, as a writer, been known for writing strong female characters and strong female voices. So that kind of solidified that. But it's also just an absolute thrill to write some of your favorite characters and then have folks read it and say, that is Captain Picard. Oh my goodness, that sounds exactly like him, So there's that's really gratifying as a creator to know that you nailed it.
What was it about, when you came up with that story? I mean, that's a cool angle to take, and obviously at the time not something that would have been afforded to any of the characters, really. I mean, they were always kind of moving along when it came to episodic television. So what was it about seeing that episode and wanted to craft something about it? Were there any other runners up in your head about other ideas you kind of wanted to do for that story? Or what was it about that story that made it that was the one you wanted to write for that submission?
Yeah. Well, I love Next Gen, and I think it has one of the strongest series finales. But, anytime you're ending a series that's that long running, you have a whole lot of loose ends to tie up. And I just thought that that sometimes really strong, sometimes traumatic things happen on the show, and characters have about 2.5 minutes to process them at the end of the episode, and then they're never mentioned again. And I know that is for very good story and plot, reasons. But again, if we were to kind of imagine this is a real person with real feelings, I wanted her to have the time and space to process what it means to love a young person and support them, even if that means that they have to go off, on their own, and what that means to sort of want what's best for them, and sometimes that means that they're going to leave. And so that's just really great storytelling ground, I guess. I think my runner-up ideas were I really wanted to explore the women of Enterprise a little bit more. T'Pol and Hoshi, I think some of their stories and arcs are fascinating to me, and so those were some of my other ideas.
What I'm always curious, when Star Trek became something that was something important to you, I guess, growing up, was it something that you shared with a family member? Was it just something you saw one day and it just kind of captured your imagination? I was curious what kind of brought someone in.
Yeah, so both of my parents enjoyed Star Trek, and so when I was growing up, there were 3 shows on: Voyager, Next Gen, and Deep Space Nine. And so we would watch them as a family. And I was absolutely starstruck by Voyager. Like the idea that they were so far from home and they had to work together to solve problems. And I was also just so inspired by Captain Janeway. She's such a strong leader and role model that I really fell in love with that show. And so like my dad is he's a lifelong Star Trek fan and science fiction reader. And so that's something that he and I have shared, when I was a kid, but now, as an adult, it's something I get to share with him also. So I got exposed to it at a young age, really loved it. He had a large collection of Star Trek novels. And so I got into those when I was old enough and just got lost in this optimistic world of exploration and wonder. And was like, oh, I would love to make stuff like this someday. And then what do you know? Here I am.
Were there other people in your family who are also in kind of the creative arts or writers as well, or were you kind of different in that regard?
My mom was an artist. She painted and sewed and did crafts, and she was a gardener, and so she just had this sort of like creative spirit. And I think she was very intentional about nurturing that in me. And then my dad was, he's an engineer. And so he just has this like scientific mind and would talk to me about how things work and like puzzling through ideas and problems and things. And so I think those two things kind of collided in some of my, pursuits later on.
When you won that contest, did it floor your parents?
Yeah, so I got the call while I was driving and I had to pull over. They're like, you remember that contest you sent in? You're one of the winners. You can't tell anyone. And I was like, can I tell my parents? They're like, yeah. so I drove over there and told my dad, and his smile was pretty big. So yeah, it was very exciting. I mean, I didn't know at that time just how much it would set me on a path of being a professional tie-in writer, but man, it's been an amazing journey the whole way. This community of writers is really incredible, and I've had the honor of being, mentored and encouraged by a lot of folks who came before me. So that's really great.
I want to ask about that. Like, you win this contest, and like, how quickly are those doors opening, or like, who's reaching out? Like, how does that community start kind of drawing you in, and how do you end up on these other projects that start developing more of a writing career?
Yeah. So I think I took the initial sort of initiative. So there's the first sort of just shot in the dark of submitting to the contest, right? But then after that, I looked up all the other authors who were in this anthology with me, and I tried reaching out to them on social media or whatever, just to connect with folks. And some of them I had good conversations with. And I also looked up, like, because it was the 50th anniversary, CBS was having a Star Trek convention in New York City. And I'd never been to a convention before, but I was like, well, seems like a good place to meet, other people. And one of the other authors who was in the book with me, his name is Derek Tyler Attico. I connected with him, and he's like, oh, I'm going to be at the convention too. Let's meet up and talk. And it turned out he is one of the most wonderful souls on the planet. And he and I became immediate friends. And so he told me about, there's this other convention called Shore Leave that you should attend. That's where a lot of professional Star Trek writers go. So like I sort of made an initiative to reach out, and once you know a couple of people, then they tell you about other opportunities, and you go to those and you meet more people, and then they tell you about other things. And so there's that aspect, but there's also, anyone who got their hands on a copy of that book and liked my story, if they were someone who was going to be doing their own anthology of some kind, I got contacted by some folks that way of like, hey, we're doing an anthology of essays about Star Trek. I read your story. I like it. Are you interested? So that kind of thing. So I think that's what they mean by sort of breaking in, that you kind of have to get into the sphere where these things are happening. And then, at least for me, things kind of happen pretty quickly. But you also have to make the time and space to go to the conventions and to reach out to people and, all of that fun stuff. But all of that said, the community itself has been very open and welcoming, and kind of they live by this sort of like hold the door for the next person, kind of mentality of helping out the up and coming generation. So that's it's a really beautiful kind of way to manage things.
It does sound like that was what you would hope and expect from a community of Star Trek fans and writers. Like, in theory, isn't that what's supposed to be about the best that we can be, right? So you would hope that people would be, welcoming and, as you said, kind of holding the door for the next.
I think Star Trek values, man. Like, if we could all just live by those.
In that original anthology that you had your first story in there, do you remember what was your favorite in that anthology that wasn't yours?
Oh, I mean, Derek's. I mean, if you've never read anything by Derek Tyler Attico, you need to. So that was actually his second time getting into one of those anthologies. He had won previously in the first run of it. And the thing I love about Derek's writing is it is unapologetically bold. So his ideas just always blow my mind. He just thinks on a really large, incredible scale. And I've had the pleasure of co-writing some things with him. So he and I have both worked on the Star Trek Adventures role-playing game from Modifius. And we found a pretty good dynamic of like the two of us work pretty well together. But he brings that to the table every single time he and I collaborate. I'm just like, Derek, where did you get that idea from? So, but I mean, all the stories are really great. But yeah, I'm kind of biased. I really love Derek's stuff.
Now, what is it like working on like a game, game guides and campaign guides? Because that's a very specific type of writing, and it's drawing on so many different kind of aspects of you as a creative person. I'm curious what it's like to work on a project like that.
Yeah, it is different than fiction writing in several ways. One of them is that you don't know who the main characters are because if you're writing a game module, it's the players and whatever characters they're bringing to the table. So you have to craft a plot and hooks and opportunities for story and conflict that could be fun and engaging for a variety of different types of characters. So that's one thing that's kind of, I think I found interesting to shift because I was doing fiction writing first and then transitioned over to games. And then I guess the other thing is just that you're not telling a linear story. You're not actually telling a story at all when you are a game writer. You are giving the GM and the players the tools to collaboratively craft their own story together. And so it's much more about opportunity and possibility and offering problems that could be solved in multiple ways than it is kind of just, crafting a narrative from beginning to end. But it's working on the Star Trek Adventures game in particular is really fun because we get to fill in a lot of these little corners and crevices of the IP that, maybe we haven't seen, on screen. My favorite project that I've worked on so far is the Shackleton Expanse campaign guide. And the assignment we were given, there was about 5 or 6 lead writers on that book. And the assignment that the line editor, Jim Johnson, gave us was, here's an area of space called the Shackleton Expanse that we've carved out that is previously unexplored. We want each of you to come up with a new playable species and a home world and ships and everything to populate this space that the players can interact with. And then we're going to write an interconnected campaign of linked adventures that involve all these species. And that was so fun. Being told, like, you can create whatever you want in the Star Trek universe, like make the coolest stuff you can imagine. So I made the Calmirans, which is a crystalline species that live on a tidally locked ocean world, and they have time sensing ability. They can kind of peek into the past and the future. They can change the state of their bodies, and when they die, they like merge into ships. So it was so fun to create these, but also to collaborate. Like, we were working pretty closely together to make sure all of our stuff kind of fit, with each other.
Did you have a prior history of having, taken part in these types of games in the past, and that you were able to translate that into the writing, or was this a wholly kind of new experience?
So the order of things went, I was doing Star Trek fiction writing, was told there was a Star Trek game, and that there was an opportunity for me to potentially write that, but I wasn't deeply into role-playing games at the time. I was familiar with them, but I started playing them and absolutely fell in love. I was like, why did I not get into this culture sooner? This is amazing. So it kind of, I think, happened simultaneously that I became a gamer and became a game writer. But because of that, I think my favorite aspect of role-playing games is the sort of almost theater of the mind aspect that we're telling a story together. So I like games that are cinematic, that are narrative, that are deeply character focused and character driven in their arcs and development, that really encourage collaboration between characters and problem solving. Rolling dice is fun, but that's not why I enjoy playing the game. I'm there for the story and the experience of playing.
Mm-hmm. Now, so let's bring it back to Marvel then. So you've been working on in a specific type of space. So how does the opportunity to work on or pitch on this book series come about with Marvel?
So they contacted me for this project, and I think it's because I was well known in the community as a tie-in writer for Star Trek stuff, and it was also known that I was a major fan of Carol Danvers. So that opportunity was, they reached out, and they reached out and said, we have an opportunity we would like to share with you. You have to sign this NDA before we can tell you what it is. I was like, oh, that means it's really good. So then once we were able to talk about it, it was like, oh yeah, that's obvious. I would love to do that.
When you were doing the research, and obviously there's a lot of research with a character like Carol, and it's interesting how a lot of it was probably, in terms of the volume of research, was probably in the last decade or so when she's been more prevalent. Because up until then, like, her appearances were a little bit more narrow. It might have been easier to kind of digest some of it. But what were the biggest surprises to you when reading about that character? And again, like, going into, the 60s, when she was not really as much of a fully formed character, which unfortunately was indicative of the time, but she was more of, the kind of the female love interest / sidekick character. So what was it like to kind of see that character progress? And as you're doing the research, how copious are your notes in terms of, okay, how do I form this narrative from this?
Oh my gosh, I have books and books of notes. Actually, they're files, in Drive or whatever. But so I went back and reread all of her named series all the way through. So that in itself is like a canon of her stuff. But then she's also part of all these other groups. So she's in the Avengers. She's all over Avengers multiple times, all across their history. She's all over X-Men. She's, the leader of the Ultimates. She was in the Starjammers, which was one of the surprises. I did not know Carol was a space pirate previously. But she is, and it's one of the delights of her history. So if you haven't read those, definitely go check that out. And pretty much, as you said, like once she becomes Captain Marvel, anytime there's a big event going on in the galaxy and there's a battle happening, she's probably there. So there were a lot of like there were her named series, the Miss Marvel series and the Captain Marvel series, and then there's all these other things, and so the challenge sometimes was tracking down those other things where it's clearly an important thing happens, but it's kind of off in this side thing that's happening. But I just kept really good notes I have a file for each series, and then I, have a chunk of notes for each issue. And that turned out to be really important because in all of the work that I was doing, I had to cite every single important fact that I put in the manuscript, the issue that I pulled it from. And that was so that Marvel could double check it, but also so that we could go back, because there's a lot of art in this book, that we could match stuff up for the text and the art. I also was invited to make art suggestions. So a lot of the stuff that's in this book is, I'm going to call it we called it media pieces, but they're like newspaper articles or magazine articles or Avengers reports or S.H.I.E.L.D. profiles or scrapbooks or things like that are a combination of text that I wrote based on the comics and then images that are pulled and sometimes very cleverly redesigned by our very talented graphic designer into looking like a convincing, surveillance tape or something. And so that was really fun to get to say, pull this image from this page of this issue, and make it look like a phone screen, or whatever. So yeah, the research was copious. It had to be comprehensive in the sense that we couldn't leave out any important things, right? Like this is supposed to be her life story. We can't leave out something, her losing her powers or something. But there's just so much in her life that there were also some difficult decisions of okay, we probably can't include absolutely everything. So we got to make some decisions here about which things to include or rather, I guess, which things to focus on.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you did focus some stuff on, and I don't recall if it was ever brought up, but I like that you mentioned it. And it was one of those things where I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense, but I don't remember it ever being brought up anywhere. Was the idea that when Mar-Vell dies, she's nowhere. She's not around. She wasn't being used actively. She wasn't there when he died, and yet that was a character that obviously had such a huge importance on her origin and who she was. Obviously the name that she now wears, in his in theory in his honor. So it was an interesting perspective to take to have her kind of be like, I wasn't there, and what that was like for her.
Yeah, it seemed like something that she has this long running relationship with Mar-Vell in several different senses, and so it would be very disturbing to find out that someone you deeply cared about had passed away and no one told you. Your friends didn't tell you what was going on and you weren't there. And so, yeah, I felt that was one of the more powerful, moving she has to kind of work through.
When doing your research, I mean, as a lifelong comic book fan, this is more obvious to me, but maybe not to a lot of other people. It's interesting that you have Mar-Vell, he passes away. We have two other Captain Marvels before Carol gets the name. She just kind of gets overlooked for a long time and just stays as Miss Marvel. So when you're doing your research, what was your impression of that, or was that surprising to you?
That she doesn't take the Captain Marvel name immediately.
Exactly.
Yeah, her code names are a whole like history in and of themselves. She has a whole bunch of them. So like she's Ms. Marvel, she is binary, she is Warbird, she's Miss Marvel again, she is Captain Marvel. And the fact that there's been multiple Captain Marvels is sometimes a little confusing. The fact that there is, that Kamala Khan is also, Ms. Marvel is also confusing. So, I think that the decision of the writers to have her take that mantle when she did felt right to me, and I like the way that they handle it. That conversation with Cap, I think, is really powerful. But yeah, it's I think her sort of flipping around with her names is indicative of her figuring out her identity, and the fact that that's often a very convoluted process for her, but that she needs to feel connected to her name and who she's presenting herself as to the world.
When you're talking about, kind of taking the notes, starting to structure the story, I'm curious at what point, like as you're putting together the overall narrative, and again, it's a very interesting way of writing it because it's not just that one person telling their story, it's a back and forth between a journalist, in this case Star, and between Carol. So you're kind of going back and forth. At what point are you in your mind kind of figuring out, well, this would be a good point for the media piece, or this would be a good point for this, because you have so many that you have to use, and some of them are, just quicker shots. It's like, a bio of this character, that character, but then you have letters from other characters, etc., kind of describing what's happening that they've just, gone over in your narrative. So what was the process of figuring out, well, which of these moments am I going to kind of take a beat on and then extrapolate and have an extra media kind of element, and how many got left on the cutting room floor because they didn't end up working well enough for the flow?
Yeah. First of all, that is an excellent question. That's one of my favorite questions that anyone has asked me about this so far. So this was one of the fun aspects of this project. So the very first thing that Marvel asked me to create after I took the assignment, and we had an initial kind of brainstorming call where they, asked me what my idea was, and I sort of put together this pitch for here's how I want to frame the book. Here's some of the big moves. The next thing I had to create was a comprehensive outline that was chapter by chapter, and within each chapter, I had to bullet point the moments of her life or the events in her life that were going to be covered in that chapter. So things like she joins the Air Force, or she joins the Avengers, or takes part in this battle, this person dies, whatever. And from that, then I was able to, during the drafting process, I would look through, okay, these are the events. This is the content that we're going to cover. And then I would brainstorm and bullet point, like, what are some cool media pieces that would help tell the story of these events, ideally that we haven't seen yet, or that allow Carol to use her voice in a way that she didn't get to use it in the original comics, or that allow for some additional perspective from someone else that would add insight to this event. So this book is meant to be a chronicle of the content of the comics. We're not inventing a lot of new stuff. Instead, we're sort of collecting it, and I'm retelling it sometimes through different eyes or different voices that have interesting perspective. So that was kind of one consideration of, like, whose voice do these things need to be in? And I feel very strongly that, particularly because Carol has been kind of, because of the ways that her character has been either victimized or traumatized, or her memories were taken away, her identity was taken away, that I wanted to make sure that some of these pieces were from her voice, her getting to express things in her own way. But she does touch a lot of lives. And so I also wanted to make sure that there were pieces from all of her fellow Avengers and her fellow X-Men and her family and her friends and her colleagues and all of those folks. And we also, when I was speaking with my editor, Elizabeth Smith, we talked about like the format of the media pieces and which ones might make particular sense for Carol, particularly as an Air Force pilot and a spacefaring Avenger. She spends a lot of time in spaceships on various teams or by herself. And so there are things like flight logs and a schematic of her spaceship and, you know, her sort of personal log of her adventures and things like that. As well as like more of what you'd expect, like shield profiles of all of the villains that she goes up against and things like that. So I tried to vary the formats and portray the content in maybe a fresh new way. I also feel like there's a lot of heavy stuff in this book, and so some of the media is meant to be a little bit lighter and even humorous. So I had fun with some of the, like, you know, Instagram-esque posts and social media stuff.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of my favorites was when you have Wolverine posting as Adamantium Canadian and just saying, Storm says I can neither confirm nor deny X-Men involvement in the incident. And I'm like, that's really funny. Like, there's just something very, very quaint, because Wolverine's a very old man. So it feels like an old man saying, like, I can't say this. I don't know, it really made me laugh. So
I just pictured him, like, you know, typing away. Like, yeah, it was very fun to imagine some of these characters in these different contexts.
I think also, I mentioned this maybe. Oh, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, also there are cat pictures for those who like that.
One thing, and I think I mentioned this off podcast before we started, but which is refreshing, is just how unabashedly comics forward this is. Because as I said before, so often, because especially with the MCU being as popular as it is in popular culture, and Carol Danvers being in the MCU, you know, I was like, I think I'm so trained and used to seeing media usually enforcing the MCU versions of characters. So what I thought was so refreshing about your book is it's so unabashedly about the comics. So, and it did make me wonder, though, you know, when you're writing this and when you're talking with your editor, et cetera, like what is the sweet spot in terms of your target audience for this? Because there's a lot of info in here. So if you're a diehard comics fan, you're going to get to re-experience all the stuff you probably, hopefully already know or may not know. If you're a new reader, you're going to be not overwhelmed, but you're going to get a lot about this character. So I'm curious how you were thinking about the target audience as you were writing it to make sure it was going to work.
Yeah, this was really important for me. I wanted this book to be a absolute delight for longtime diehard comic fans who are going to find little tiny cool references to corners of the comics minutia, that I appreciate, that are hidden in here, and that I really did get in the weeds with some of this and highlight some of the gems that I really appreciate in the Marvel Comics canon that relate to Carol. But I also wanted this to be a book that anyone could pick up, whether you have previous experience with the Marvel Universe in any form, whether you've seen some of the MCU or whether you've ever touched a comic at all. If you're even vaguely familiar with the idea of a superhero, I wanted a person like that to be able to pick this up and read it and enjoy a good story about a really compelling female character. And that was one of my sort of guiding principles here, that this has to be beginner friendly while also really doing justice to the comprehensive nature of this, and that it truly is meant to be kind of a reference document. Like, this is a chronicle of her life as we know it right now. So I was aiming for both, and I will be interested to hear from readers, kind of across the spectrum, how they feel about that, if they felt that I hit that.
One thing I really appreciated about how you use the form is that by using Ripley or Star as your interview character, it allowed the interviews themselves to be charged with something different than just someone relating a story. And that there was this tension, and then as you get to the end of the book, it ratchets up more because you get to the points that are actually about Ripley. Or she starts to become involved in the narrative, as opposed to at the beginning. She's starting to empathize with Carol more, starting to understand more, because she's starting to learn more about her as a character. But once you get to the spot where she's actually part of the narrative as well, you can feel it be a lot more charged. And so I thought it allowed the storytelling to transcend a little bit from just being a chronicle of this character's life to being more about the history between these two women as well.
Yeah, thanks for taking note of that. That was one of my thoughts when I chose Ripley, and I knew she was kind of an unconventional choice for interviewer because of their history together, antagonistic history. But I really did want that built-in conflict that could, and that tension that I think makes for interesting dialogue. But also, I think Carol's handling of her interactions with Ripley at certain points in the comics are bad. Like, Carol's not blameless. She mishandles things sometimes, and I think Ripley has a point at times, like that. Yeah, okay, Carol, maybe you have made some mistakes here, and so I thought that dynamic would be an interesting opportunity for them to kind of discuss things. But on that same note, like, they share a lot in common. They've been through a lot of similar experiences. And so I thought it would be nice to have someone who does kind of get some of what Carol's talking about.
I know I have to let you go in about a minute or two, but I guess the last question I'll ask, and I'm always curious about this kind of stuff, is that with your chapters, and in your case, each chapter kind of being its own recording session, what led you, or what shaped the titles of each of your chapters? Because you're basically going through the different stages of her life, but I'm curious how conscious that was, how early in the process you were starting to formulate it that way, and how you structured some of the interviews around what the overall kind of name of the chapter was.
Yeah, so this was very intentional. As a writer, I'm just a very heavy outliner. Like, I do a lot of structuring of all of the things that I write before I really start writing them, which worked really well because that was a required part of this process of working with Marvel, that I had to have a comprehensive outline, to begin with. And so when I was trying to figure out, like, okay, how am I going to break it down into chapters, I sort of made a giant list, a chronological list of all the really important events in her life, and then kind of started figuring out where I could identify thematic chunks. And some of them are obvious, right? There's some obvious sort of momentous turning points in her life. So, like, the first chapter is called Officer, and deals with her as an Air Force pilot, and it ends with her encountering the psych magnetron, which activates her powers. So there were some that were, like, super obvious, of like, okay, here's the point where the chapter is going to end. But there were other ones that I had to look a little deeper to find, okay, what's sort of the theme for this era of her life? And those themes in some of the chapters ended up providing a really great, I guess, focal point for Ripley's questions. So there's one chapter that's called Hero, that is the chapter in which they kind of talk through some of Carol's participation in various teams, but also like her recovery from alcoholism, Superhero Registration Act. And so I don't know. I think it kind of emerged, but it was definitely intentional that I knew I had to block this out into chunks. That having the interviews sort of broken up into sessions that felt like they had a focus was going to be better than trying to just have it all be one long running thing. And my editor was particularly helpful with this part, especially with developing. There's kind of like little intros and outros to each chapter that help with that sort of thematic framing. So cannot say enough about how important it is to have a good editor on a book like this. And I was very, very lucky to have a fantastic one. So it was very fun to come up with the titles of all of the chapters because I think it echoes all of the different personas that Carol has had over her lifetime.
It's interesting reading the book because I'm very familiar with the character, but there's still pieces I forget. And one thing I really enjoyed was that when you're talking about her original days as Miss Marvel, the fact that she did not know she was Miss Marvel, and how you then tie that idea of kind of having this blackout and not knowing who you are in that moment, or not realizing that you are something else, and then tying that in with her not having access to the emotional resonance of her memories later on in her life. And, as you say, like these recurring patterns that happen to this character that weren't necessarily intentional from the writers at the time, but once you kind of lay it all out, you're like, oh, wow, there's a lot of recurring patterns here.
There are. And that was fun to deal with, but also like something to manage because, these comic series were published decades apart. But if you lay all of this next to each other, you don't want parts to feel repetitive in any way. And so I really had to sort of think about how to portray that as kind of echoes and like a revisiting of things that was meaningful and that was moving her forward in her trajectory.
Excellent. Well, Kelli, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this book. And I believe it's coming out, March 4th or so?
March 4th.
March 4th. So people should definitely go check out the book. It was a tremendous read, really interesting and fun. And as I mentioned off podcast, I didn't even realize it was the fourth in the series when I read it. So there's 3 other books you can go check out in the same kind of line. But Kelli, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.